This episode is brought to you by Cobury Digital. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Entrepreneur Rush. With me today, as always, is Thomas Schöpf, and today we're going to delve into the biggest Facebook myth that you cannot fall prey to in 2021. You excited for this one, Thomas?
Very much so.
I mean, I know Facebook is one of your darlings, one of your favorite platforms. You know, one of those platforms that although it's been around for a while, it's the advertising king. And although prices are going up, it's very likely going to remain so for a while. It's just so developed. A lot of the new features on there are just amazing, and their data usage, you know, it's just a cool one. I love this one for advertisers. So, Thomas, let's jump right into it.
Absolutely. Let's jump right into it. The first myth you cannot fall prey to anymore is that you need to start with a traffic objective campaign. Now, let's say you've just started, right? You have no data on the pixel yet. You have no purchases on your web shop yet. And you're starting advertising on Facebook, and people are telling you, look, you don't have the data you need. You need to start with a traffic objective. Myth. It used to be the case that Facebook needed more data from you, needed people to have visited your website for you to give it data in the form of, purchases and so on. And then it could start optimizing your other campaigns. But nowadays, that's no longer the case. Facebook just has so much data. It knows everything it needs to know, and your campaigns will get better over time. And so if you start with a conversion campaign, for that matter, if you start with a traffic campaign as well, on a web shop that's brand new, has no data and so on, your campaigns will not do as well as they will 1 month, 2 months down the line. But they will both be starting at zero. And over time, the two campaigns will improve and get better. It's just that the conversion one will get so much better. And over time, we'll just have much, much better data because it's optimizing around the right thing. It's optimizing around people who are buying, who are purchasing. And that's exactly the kind of person you want to be bringing to your web shop, not just someone who clicks a link, reads a bit, and leaves again. So both in the short term and the long term, conversion objective is the way to go if that's what you're trying to do. You do not need to start with a traffic objective just because your web shop is new.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's shocking to me because so many people, are hearing about this myth, right? It's every forum you go to, everyone you talk to, even advertisers that have been around for a while, because the logic is there. I mean, how are we going to optimize for conversions when they don't know who's converting? We need to have a lot of link clicks so that the pixel understands who pays a lot of attention to my site, who actually clicks around, who adds to cart, etc. But the reality of it is, as you said, Facebook is just too powerful. That's no longer the case. And the traffic objective, although in the short term they're going to perform equally similar, the difference down the road is just tremendous. If you're running with the traffic objective over time, you will be losing out on so many conversions. I mean, I saw a Statistica report saying upwards of 80% is the difference in conversion rate once you push through. So I really think it's one of those myths you cannot fall prey to. It's one of the most important ones. Please, everyone, start with the objective conversion always and stick to that.
Yeah, and on top of that, it's linked to kind of this bigger myth that you know better than Facebook, that you have to trick Facebook in some way by, for example, using the traffic objective instead of the conversion objective. But Facebook nowadays, with it's so far developed, it's so far ahead, it's pretty straightforward and logical, right? If you want to get more conversions, conversion objective. If you want to drive awareness, do so with video view campaigns, engagement campaigns, and so on. There's no need to trick the system. It's pretty straightforward.
It's pretty straightforward, and it's there to help you, right? That's what's important to understand. Facebook does well when you do well. The more sales you have, the more you're going to spend on advertising. And the same goes for the traffic objective, right? Because the traffic objective does hold some value. It's great at providing traffic. It's just not driving conversions. It's driving a lot of people that are curious, a lot of people that tend to visit websites and look around. So if you really are just looking for that kind of awareness, if you really are just trying to test out your landing pages, if your goal is to find out if everything makes sense in terms of your storytelling, if people are engaging to the extent you want, well, then you might want to consider the traffic objective, but do it only in terms of testing these aspects, because it's really not going to drive sales. It's not going to pull leads. It's not going to do any of those things that you can do in a conversion campaign.
Exactly, yeah. The traffic campaign, like you say, Emil, has its uses, has its place and time, but when you're trying to sell, that's not necessarily it. Let's move on to myth number 2.
Yeah, let's have a look at the next myth on the list. So one of the things we hear a lot right now in advertising is that you need to target very narrowly, right? You need to find your core audience. This is the beauty of digitalization, that you can target just who you want, unlike in TV and radios where you sort of understand the audience. Online, you can say you have these 7 interests and you're this old and you have this income, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And interestingly, in the last year or so, this is no longer the case. You don't want these perfectly tailored narrow audiences. You want to make bigger audiences where you have one or two interests and where you only focus a little bit on age and income, etc., and then let Facebook use its data, use its understanding of your company, and then your campaigns over time will be a lot better. So basically the myth is, right, make narrow audiences, and the truth is, do not do this. Your CPMs will be too high and your conversion prices will go up. In the short run, it's usually fine, but very quickly you'll notice as you get in more data, Facebook will just be able to provide better results if you've given it the freedom to better target itself, right? To find out whether it should be targeting females or males. And this even goes for products where it's largely male dominant. Facebook will not spend a lot of budget on the females, but every now and then there will be a purchase and you will actually notice that it's often cheaper than the male one, which I think is super interesting. And the same goes for age groups, placements, etc. All of these things, like, it's fine to test if you have a very specific reason to, and really if you just in no circumstance want to hit a certain age group or gender, it's fine. But for the very large majority of cases, leave it pretty open-ended. And, once you've tested the things you want to test, combine groups and bigger audiences so that you get to around the 2-3 million mark audiences, because that's where you really can drive results.
And I mean, it makes sense. Are you really smarter than Facebook, right? Are you really going to be able to know more about everyone on Facebook, about your target audience, than the data Facebook's collecting? It's continuously optimizing. It's an incredibly extensive algorithm that will just be able to target better than you can. And like Emil said, right, if it's a target group that is smaller where you're like, look, most men aren't interested in my product, or most people under the age of 25 aren't interested in my product, it's still worth keeping in. Facebook knows that as well. It's going to spend a lot less on these people, but the lead they get from that, or the purchase they get from that every now and then, is more than makes up for it.
Absolutely. The one exception I think goes in, especially leads that are a big thing to drive on Facebook today, is in the quality, right? Facebook cannot assess what happens beyond Facebook. So you have to be very good at saying, okay, this audience is actually driving leads at a great price, but they're not converting to customers. And that's where you manually want to go in and say, okay, exclude this aspect or exclude these sort of people. Maybe the younger audience is simply not buying your product because they're not in a position to, but they are very curious. They do fill out the forms a lot. And therefore, in the eyes of Facebook, they are converting, right? So you do want to have that aspect of manual testing. You want to use your common sense, but in terms of the overarching aspects, you really need to trust in Facebook's ability to utilize data, because that's what they do.
And that brings us back to the first kind of myth we were talking about, right? That's exactly why you want to use conversions, for example, and not traffic. Or if you're doing something else, you want to make sure that the conversion event is the right one, and that you're using value-based, that you're giving Facebook an idea of how much value each conversion is bringing in, because then Facebook can do exactly what Emil was talking about here, right? Then Facebook can tell, oh, this person is actually more valuable than that person, even though they both theoretically did the same thing, right? If they both fill out a lead, but Facebook then knows which one actually converts, then all of a sudden it will know which person is more valuable than the other.
Absolutely. And once you get to the more technical aspects of your marketing, you can actually inform Facebook, Google, and other platforms as well, like the actual conversion value that the individual people have. You can upload data sheets, etc., and then it will even better, right, have an understanding of, okay, this guy became a customer, but he was worth this much, and therefore this audience, has a higher value. And so the myth, right, the interesting thing is, where did it stem from? Because it's not one of those, similar to the aspect previously, that, it's just plain wrong, was never the case. It used to be the case that you wanted to tailor perfectly. You wanted to have like 25 to 30, 30 to 35. You wanted to test different cities, different states to get the best results. But once again, as the algorithm has developed, as more and more advertisers have come on the platform, as more data has become available, and as it's developed in that line, it's simply able to do all of this testing on its own. It'll, allocate very narrow budgets to different age groups, to different locations, and then very quickly find out what works and what doesn't work. And it will even look into data from other vendors that have similar things as you do, seeing, okay, this is normally what works, and therefore it'll be able to very, very quickly find out something that perhaps would take you a long time to test. And finally, I want to add on that you do know a lot about your audience. And of course, we're not saying that Facebook in every aspect is better at understanding it, but it's also important to remember that what works online and what works on Facebook is not necessarily what works for you in your physical store or on your other platforms. So maybe your audience, your core audience is what you think it is, but that audience is just not the one that buys on Facebook. And therefore, it's also really an eye-opener to sometimes have another platform say, look, you're right, this is usually your core audience, but on here, due to limited competition or whatever other reason, that's become your core audience, right? That's what you want to target here. And anyway, that's it for this myth. Let's jump right into the third one, Thomas.
Yeah. So the third myth is that Facebook is too expensive or has become too expensive. Now, again, this myth arises out of, the Facebook's past, back in the so-called golden years when Facebook, everything on Facebook was incredibly cheap, right? And we have seen prices rise. The cost per view, cost per impression, and so on has risen, which obviously drives prices everywhere else as well. But that does not mean Facebook is too expensive. Facebook is still one of the best platforms to advertise. It's still one of the one of the cheapest platforms we have. And, the range of things you can do there is just amazing. The reason people think it's too expensive, right, is because the cost has been driven up and because now you can no longer do what you used to be able to do. You can't blindly advertise on Facebook without any strategy and for products that no one wants. What you have to do nowadays is, you have to have a strategy. You have to realize, why am I doing this? How am I going about this? And you have to have a product or service or whatever that people actually want. However, will it get too expensive? That's a question, right? Because soon we'll see major companies like Coca-Cola and so on start spending more of their advertising budget on Facebook and these social media platforms, whereas right now they're spending a lot on television and radio and so on. And then we'll see the price being driven up.
Yeah, I mean, once Coca-Cola and the others wake up, Facebook is going to have a very tough time, but we're still very far from this. I mean, you made it clear, but I want to make it even clearer. Facebook is hugely underpriced still. I mean, Facebook is just way too cheap. The price of common radio, the price of TV ads, it's through the roof. It makes absolutely no sense. You don't have access to the same data. You can't tailor the same way. You can't follow up. All the things you can do online are just not available. And even the other, as you touched upon, other platforms that are available right now, they're much more expensive. Even some of the newer ones, even the ones that aren't as popular. I mean, despite the popularity of Facebook, despite it being a marketplace, they're still significantly cheaper than LinkedIn, YouTube, etc. And it's crazy. I mean, if you cannot succeed on Facebook, it absolutely is your lack of strategy or the fact that you have a product that people aren't interested in. We've made a few other podcasts and blog posts about this, right? It's all about understanding the digital customer journey, tapping into that universe, figuring out how to target people, when to target them, what story to tell, how to follow up. But once you get all of that, Facebook is still a fantastic platform. It's going to be for years to come. And the large majority of our clients see huge success on there, from startup to scale up, and even, heading the size of powerhouses. And very, very soon, other of the major conglomerates will realize the same thing, and then prices will go up. But even for a while there, Facebook is going to be valuable. And it's also important to remember that as Facebook has become more popular, they've reinvested a lot of that capital they've gained, right? They bought platforms such as WhatsApp and Instagram that brings them new value. They've developed the advertising tools. They continue, unlike all the other platforms, to listen to advertisers. They invite agencies like us to discuss, to give them things that they need to improve on, to help us better advertise. And therefore, as prices go up, so will the availability of tools and the usage of data. And for those companies that have great strategy and great products, you can use Facebook for a lot of years. And with that, let's jump right into the fourth and final myth of today, the one you do not want to fall prey to if you want to succeed with Facebook advertising in 2021 and beyond. And that is that Facebook ads are only for e-commerce, not heavy B2B, right? For B2B, you want to go to LinkedIn or you want to go to specific search queries on Google. We probably all heard it, right, Thomas? But that's just not true. That's absolutely not true. And that's one of those myths of today that has no ground, right? It's not one of those that used to be the case or not at all. I mean, B2B has been amazing on Facebook for as long as I can remember. It's actually one of my preferred platforms for B2B. It works, great in unison with other platforms. So it is true that it can be hard to hit the B2B audience if you don't have any data, or if you don't have any understanding of who your segment is. But once you have that, once you've gotten a few searches through Google, or you have data on your website, or you've set up an audience on LinkedIn, then closing those sales on Facebook and driving leads is just absolutely amazing. I don't want to elaborate too much on this one because there's just not that much to say. I mean, B2B works amazingly well. Facebook is absolutely also a B2B platform. And in fact, looking at the data from our clients, B2B audiences tend to have a higher ROAS than e-commerce does, right? It's actually the one that drives better results and that's easier to make sustainable because of the increasing competition of e-commerce and the lower margins that we're seeing.
Exactly, as you said, right? Facebook doesn't have the targeting options that you have on, for example, LinkedIn. But at the same time, just because someone has a position as a higher up in a company, right, or is the person you're trying to target for B2B, that doesn't mean they don't use Facebook, Instagram, or anyone else in Facebook's audience network. These are still real people. They're still browsing Facebook. And if they see something that's interesting to their business, to their company, they're still going to click in on it. They're still going to sign up for your lead forms and so on. And the potential there, like you said, it's so much cheaper than it is on other platforms. And the ROASs are just entirely something else.
Yeah, and I think it again comes back to the tools that are available, right? Because beyond pricing and beyond the fact that they might not have a business frame of mind when they're on there, they just have so many different kinds of ads that you can run, so many different funnels that you can build. Whereas LinkedIn and other platforms, they're not yet there. It becomes very much the same, and you're surrounded by other advertisers that are trying to do the same thing. Whereas on Facebook, it's not entirely a business network, right? It is still a general social media, so you can stand out. You can do things that are different. You can be the one that provides that sort of value that a lot of people aren't doing, right? Rather than selling to them, you can have a video that provides some sort of a value, and you can build on that. They can sign up, and then you can follow up with them. Whereas, if you do that on LinkedIn, well, everyone else is doing that as well. So you're not really that different. This is especially what we're seeing on TikTok, right? The people that are using TikTok as a business platform, the people that are going onto TikTok to provide value are seeing tremendous success despite it being a platform generally for entertainment because the competition is not there.
But what that doesn't mean is that you should only use Facebook for B2B. Obviously, these other platforms, like LinkedIn, for example, are great as well. The problem there, right, is that it's too expensive. And that's where Facebook comes in, because what you can do is get initial leads or link clicks or traffic to your website on LinkedIn, on Google, where each one of these people is much more expensive to attain, and then remarket to them on Facebook. Because then, if they require multiple ads, if they require 5 or 6 touch points, get that expensive one on LinkedIn or Google and so on, and then get the cheap ones, the follow-up ones on Facebook, where, like you said, you have so many tools to just customize that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's all about seeing the strengths and weaknesses of different platforms, about using them in unison, about understanding your customer and where in their current part of the digital journey they are. And also, especially for B2B, to finish that one, the customer journeys there are usually a lot longer, especially for some more complicated products. I mean, we're seeing a lot of our clients really drive revenue down the 6-month line. And that really does, require that you follow them on different platforms, or it becomes too similar. It becomes too much of the same. Whereas if you show different angles, if you have one perspective on LinkedIn, another on Facebook, and you really tie it together, that's when down the line conversions will come.
Love it. Absolutely. Yeah, I think we've covered all 4 major myths so far. Emil, do you want to just summarize the main takeaway here?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are 4 myths that you want to avoid, right away and in 2021 and beyond. The first one is that you should start with the traffic objective before switching to conversions, right? So if you have a brand new pixel, a lot of people will tell you that you need to start with traffic to drive data and then switch to conversions. This is not the case. Conversions will do better, both short and long term. And although it is true that it'll take a while before it really performs, that's also the case for traffic objectives. Further, when it comes to targeting, unlike what you used to have to do, right? You don't have to narrowly target anymore. It's no longer about saying 25 to 30, 30 to 35 females and you live here. No, it's about making larger audiences, upwards of around 2-3 million. And the same goes for your lookalikes, by the way. Consider the country you're in. You want to get audiences up around these numbers. And if you're targeting smaller areas, make your lookalikes a lot bigger. So you try to hit the 3 million mark. Do, of course, narrow it. Give it some insight. Share, remarketing lists, tell it about the interests that are relevant, but keep it at that. Then we move on to the fact that a lot of people think Facebook is too expensive simply because it's risen in price. And yeah, it has risen in price, right? This is a fact and it will continue to, but Facebook is still underpriced. In the past, it was just way too underpriced. So Facebook is good to go for a lot of years. The only exception being if you go in there blindly advertising with no strategy and a horrible product. And finally, the 4th myth, right? That e-commerce is the only thing you can advertise on Facebook, when in reality, B2B actually usually does better and provides higher ROAS. So Facebook is fine for e-commerce, for B2B, and everything in between. All right, everyone, that's it for today's episode. We hope you enjoyed it and that you will not fall prey to these myths in 2021. They're really hurting you. It's super important that you understand how Facebook works and that you don't remain stuck in the past, that you follow the development that Facebook is going through so that you can better take advantage of all the tools that it continues to give you. And now's the time to share and subscribe.